Hey everyone, my name is Vincent Danen. I work at Red Hat. I'm the Vice President of Product Security. I've been in open source for almost 25 years, 15 years at Red Hat, 8 years at Mandriva prior to that. I've also created and contributed to a number of open source projects. I've worked on upstream security teams like PHP, WebKit, a couple others. And I'm here today to talk about some of the differences and similarities in open source and proprietary software, particularly in the area of risk acceptance when it comes to security vulnerabilities. So security has been top of mind across a number of industries over a number of years. Right? There are new regulatory frameworks. I appreciate what Dan was talking about in the earlier session, that software vendors are being required to adhere to across all industries, whether it's telco, financial services, automotive, and governments. And with that continuing rise of supply chain attacks and data breaches, many of them making huge headlines, sometimes on a daily basis, it's no surprise that a lot of eyes continue to be on open source, particularly when it comes to security. And I'm going to assert that open source very often gets the short end of the stick when it comes to those conversations. So bear with me a little bit as I'm going to kind of take us through the Wayback Machine before we kind of move forward a little bit. So I'm sure that everyone in the room has heard of CVE, or the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures Database, that catalogs software bugs that have security implications. In the first 5 years that the CVE program existed, the annual numbers grew exponentially. Now that could be easily attributed to more vendors adopting CVE and the program capturing more data on vulnerabilities. And then over the next decade, it increased by about another 40% and stayed relatively steady until 2017, where we saw about 125% increase in reported CVEs, which then increased another 40% over the next 5 years. Now that can be attributed to the rapid development of software, right? More software means more vulnerabilities. CVE continues to be that dominant means of representing vulnerabilities in software, but we know it's not perfect. There are things that are not security issues that get a CVE name, and not all vulnerabilities get CVE names either. And if CVE becomes more widely adopted, say, in the mobile application space, as one example, we could see yet another explosion of CVEs. Now, the thing that's critical to be aware of is that the guidance in 1999 to security practitioners was to patch everything. That guidance has not changed. And yet, in under 25 years, the number of CVEs has increased over 2,700%, comparing 1999 to 2023. Now, the number of vulnerabilities are an indicator, but they're not actually an indicator of compromise, or even an indicator of potential compromise. They are simply a data point. Right? We have to recognize that not all vulnerabilities matter, not all vulnerabilities get exploited, or will even attempt to be exploited, and not all vulnerabilities, if exploited, will actually lead to a compromise. So the real data point that we have to pay attention to here is software exploitation. So CISA, the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, makes available a known exploited vulnerabilities database that alerts to proven exploitation of software and ties that back to CVEs. Now, using that database, we can see that exploitation grows year over year, like the number of CVEs, but nowhere near to the same extent. And when we look at risk, the number of vulnerabilities is a useful metric, but it actually isn't that useful. Right? As one example, in 2005, there were just under 5,000 CVEs reported, with one known to be exploited. But not everyone who used that software was exploited, including if they used a vulnerable version of that software. So there's a slew of other factors that determine whether or not you might be a victim, right? Things like network topology, other security technologies such as firewalls, where that software lived, and what that software does. So those are all very important considerations that we don't typically take into account. And even then, while the number of CVEs over that 20-year period grew at a ridiculous rate, the amount of available software obviously grew as well. And yet exploitation rates stayed relatively steady. So you can see that it's always been less than 1% of known vulnerabilities are ever exploited, and an even smaller percentage of companies or individuals get compromised based on those exploitations globally. So that means that the odds of a successful exploitation against a company using a software vulnerability are vanishingly small. Now, it's easy to focus on technology to look for fixes. right? But the real things to think about are pretty clear when you look at the sources of these breaches. Verizon's data breach investigations report shows that breaches through software exploitation are single-digit events. Exploitation through people and process are the source of the vast majority of breaches. So think phishing, spoofing, misconfiguration, weak passwords, and so on. And I actually also put the lack of patching for when patches are available squarely in that people and process bucket as well. So let's take a look at that Verizon report that they published 2 years ago. Even though they noted that exploited vulnerabilities were up compared to previous years, the number of breaches caused by exploited software continues to be quite small. Only about 7% of breaches were due to a software exploitation or an exploited vulnerability. The 2023 report actually showed a decline, and that number was 5%. Now, in all fairness, the 2024 report was higher at 15%, but that was driven by the highly exploited MOVEit vulnerability, and incidentally, MOVEit is proprietary software. So the largest contributors to breaches continue to be stolen credentials, business email compromise, phishing campaigns, and improperly configured software, or human exploitation versus software exploitation. Those are the top contributors to a successful breach. Now, I kept the 2022 report mentioned because of this particular illustration. So most attackers perform scans for weaknesses against IPs and open ports, and of those scans, a smaller subset will demonstrate a potential weakness, a smaller number of which are actual vulnerabilities, and of those that are actual vulnerabilities, an even smaller subset permit remote code execution, which is where we actually see breaches starting to happen. So less than 1% of what gets scanned yields remote code execution, and again in 2022, that represented roughly 7% of successful breaches. So that actually illustrates a few primary considerations. First, the weakest element is always the human element. Someone clicked something that they shouldn't have or believed something that they shouldn't have. Second, proper configuration and hardening of software post-deployment is key. And finally, it's common knowledge that good security is built up of multiple layers. Think monitoring and detection, security education, firewalls, and physical security, just to name a few. Now, patching is one layer, but it's a statistically insignificant one at that. And ironically, it's also the one that gets the most attention, especially when it comes to open source. But that's a bit of a red herring, because a lot of proprietary software these days also include open source. The 2024 Synopsys Open Source Security and Risk Analysis report scanned over 1,000 code bases with their Black Duck software last year, and it showed that 96% of what they scanned contained some open source, and that 77% of all code originated from open source. Now, I can't get into all the details of the report, but it is very interesting and definitely worth reading. And I'll just say that if anyone has any doubt that open source has won, and is not just widely used, but also widely accepted, doubt no longer. So the software development rules changed. Open source is not the outlier that it once was. But the software risk assessment rules haven't changed. So what do I mean by that? Open source, by its very nature, is open. The code is open, reporting is open, bugs are visible, and that means that security-relevant bugs are easy enough to find. It very much means that the emperor has no clothes, because everything is visible. Now, anything that looks remotely like a security issue, no matter how improbable or unlikely it is to cause any kind of damage, is labeled as such. Well, why? Because transparency is a core tenet of open source. It's not possible to hide something, so we call it for what it is. And that's why you see so many vulnerabilities in open source spread across a variety of impacts, and they tend to land in that lower half, right? So the industry typically rates things, the severity impacts by critical, important, moderate, or medium, and low. Most open source vulnerabilities tend to sit in that moderate range. And when we talk about impact ratings, we mean the impact of successful exploitation and the conditions to exploit. So a critical vulnerability is one that's very easy and yields high privileges, right? So think remote code execution from an unauthenticated user. An important rating would be given to a similar issue with the same yield, but it's a little more difficult to exploit. So maybe you need to be local rather than remote, or it does require some authentication. Moderate issues are those that are even harder to exploit, require unlikely configurations or misconfigurations, and they would yield less impact to confidentiality, integrity, or availability. And finally, low issues are those that yield minimal consequences and require some really unlikely configurations or circumstances. And if you're here and you've ever had to dealt with CVSS, you can see here a part of the CVSS user guide that proves the industry has been using CVSS wrong pretty much since its inception. CVSS-based scores do not measure risk. It's a prioritization mechanism so that you know that if you have a dozen vulnerabilities, which one should you be addressing first? Now, CVSS is a fantastic guide when it's used correctly, but unfortunately, most people in software do not use it correctly. So let's take a look at some real data. Red Hat, as an enterprise open source vendor, will not hide vulnerabilities, and we are very transparent with our data. And every year we publish a risk report, Crobe knows intimately, that goes into a lot of detail of what we saw and what we dealt with during the year. So these are last year's risk report numbers, and they tell us a few important things. While you can never call any software totally secure, I believe that this demonstrates that open source is trustworthy. It also highlights that while there might be a lot of CVEs in open source, most of them actually don't get exploited. So for an enterprise open source vendor like Red Hat, where our customers depend on us for stability, it doesn't make sense to patch everything. As one example, we had over 1,000 CVEs that we rated moderate last year, and only 3 of them had known exploitation. Well, how about proprietary software? I'm not going to name any specific names, but this is from public data provided by a major proprietary vendor. You'll also note that on the previous slide, I used the word discovered, and here I'm using the word reported for a very specific reason that I'll get into in a moment. Now, looking at CVEs with a release date in 2023, there are some striking differences from the Red Hat risk report. First, they had reported 1,281 vulnerabilities that were affecting them, yet only 1,038 had a severity rating. Now, this vendor uses the same 4-point scale that we do, so that's a very interesting omission. And on the surface, exploitation rates seem about the same, although their exploitation rate is much higher amongst moderate issues and quite low on those higher rated vulnerabilities. The overall exploitation rate is double Red Hat's, although there are less total vulnerabilities. But I think there's a better way that we can compare and contrast the two. So when we look at the overall weight of vulnerability ratings, there are 2 things to keep in mind. One, ratings are pretty objective and consistent. So if you have an easily exploitable vulnerability that results in arbitrary code execution without authentication, every single vendor is going to call that critical. If you have a temporary file race condition that requires shell access, pretty much every vendor is going to call that low. Second, the use of that software and thus the resulting impact might be different. So that's why you might see the same CVE rated differently in different products. Using Red Hat as an example, the same component available in Red Hat Enterprise Linux might be rated higher than its use in OpenShift. For RHEL, since it's an operating system, we don't know how the end user is going to use that component, so we're going to rate it based on the worst possible outcome. In OpenShift, however, that component might be used in a very specific, very non-vulnerable way that an attacker can't get to, and so it might be rated lower because it's effectively internal plumbing to that product. Now, that distinction is important, and I would probably guess, even giving a fairly wide margin, there should be some consistency across the board in terms of percentages of moderate issues to, say, critical issues. Yet, as you can see here, the numbers are inverted. We had less than 1% of our total vulnerabilities discovered rated critical, and yet this vendor had nearly 10 times that number rated critical. We had 20% rated important, and this vendor had nearly 86% rated important. The bulk of the open source vulnerabilities in our products, almost 80%, are rated moderate and low. And yet a very, very small 4.5% of the proprietary vendors' vulnerabilities are rated moderate and low. What's actually even more curious, when you look at those 48 vulnerabilities that this vendor reported as moderate and low, 36 of them were actually in open source components and publicly known as a result. The others were publicly reported by a researcher. So the only logical conclusion that we can infer here is that not only did the software development rules change, the security reporting rules changed too. Remember that I said that Red Hat had discovered 1,670 vulnerabilities affecting our products, and 1,281 vulnerabilities were reported by that proprietary vendor. Proprietary software by its very nature is opaque. You can't see the code. If a vulnerability exists in it, you'll only know it if somebody tells you. You can't discover it by looking at the source code that you don't have access to. And you can't even quickly determine if a bug that you found is security relevant without sometimes very significant effort. But that doesn't mean that those vulnerabilities are not there. Now, most proprietary vendors will tell you about critical and important issues because they are the easiest to find, the easiest to exploit, and can cause the most damage. So they rightly ignore the moderate and low issues, either by not giving them a CV name in public when they fix them, or by not fixing them at all. And that has two impacts. First, it lowers the total number of vulnerabilities, which could amplify that look how secure we are message. And the second, as the end user, you can't mitigate what you don't know about. Now, open source's transparency is more a problem for compliance auditors, frankly, than it is for real security. It means that you will have vulnerabilities that show up on a checklist, and you might not be able to tick that box. And that's okay. This is where actual risk assessments come into play, and it affords advantages. You can mitigate without patching software if you know about it, and you know how you may be exposed. If there are no mitigations and it's truly impactful due to your use of it, you can approach your vendor, assuming that you're paying for it, for a fix, or you can rip it out and replace it with something that you're more comfortable with. Now, the most important takeaway here is that proprietary vendors are under no obligation to tell you that they have found any vulnerabilities, and few ways for us to hold them accountable to that. They will inform you of those that are truly risky to help customers avoid significant risk. The rest they will admit to if a security researcher finds it and discloses it publicly, oftentimes happens at DEF CON, et cetera. And I believe that proprietary vendors want to protect their customers from meaningful security issues. Open source does not have what I'll call the luxury, perhaps, of not informing end users about security issues. They are open and will always be public. So that means that we need to become comfortable with explicitly accepting known lower severity risk in open source, because you already accept unknown lower severity risk from proprietary vendors implicitly. It doesn't make sense to judge the open and transparent more harshly than the closed and opaque. And yet that happens every single day. Now, proper risk assessment means looking beyond lists of CVs. Most vulnerability scanners will tell you that they have this covered, but they also don't do a very good job of it. Very few take your applications, your environment, or your use of that software into account. Many end up reporting a lot of noise without applying any intelligence or remediation suggestions beyond get a patch. Most tend to equate CVSS base scores provided by the National Vulnerability Database with risk, big no-no, and most tend to ignore vendor-provided data. And that volume has only gotten bigger and noisier with containerized deployments where your infrastructure can have hundreds of containers affected by the exact same CV. Now, I'm personally looking forward to the rise of AI in this space to help better surface real risk to users. If our goal is risk reduction, which it should be, then we need to realize that what we're doing isn't working. If 80% of our security budgets and tools are being spent to find software vulnerabilities that don't get exploited, rather than solving the human element, where 80% of those breaches happen, then our priorities are wrong, and we will continue to see more breaches, more data exfiltration, more customer data misused, and more ransomware demands. Surprise, proper risk assessment means actually assessing risk and mitigating what is most impactful and most probable. Proper risk assessment is not no known vulnerabilities. That is a game that we are losing, and it is only going to get worse. There is a cost to chasing that dream, and it is very high. A proper risk assessment will tell you that you can ignore tar, for example, in a container unless you're untarring untrusted input from remote users. It will tell you that you can ignore kernel driver CVs for hardware that you don't even run in your environment and are only exposed to on the container platform that, if properly configured, would require a high level of privilege anyways. And if an attacker already has that privilege, they don't need to exploit USB traffic or load a wireless driver to get it. And that's why Red Hat, in particular, focuses on critical and important vulnerabilities across all of our products, and we will treat any moderate or low that is being exploited in the wild as a critical, and we get a fix out right away, because then it's actually become meaningful. If we go back to those earlier numbers from last year, that's 4 vulnerabilities out of over 1,300. That's 1,300 vulnerabilities where we're not introducing code changes that could have other impacts to a customer's operating environment. And it's 1,300 that our customers don't have to test for and upgrade. And since we're talking about exploitation and risk, can anyone tell me what's wrong with this alert that CISA released last month? Well, on one hand, it is Flash, yes. On the one hand, 10 years to widely exploit a Flash vulnerability is interesting because those used to get exploited pretty fast. But Flash went end of life at the end of 2020, almost 4 years ago. Now, since CISA's audience is primarily the US government, we can assume they saw exploitation of 4 10-year-old vulnerabilities in a product that no one should have been using for the last 4 years. And that's why software life cycles matter more than you think. When someone complains to me about wanting fixes for low-rated vulnerabilities in a currently supported product, and then I find out that they're still using RHEL 4, which went end of life 7 years ago, I have a really hard time believing them when they say that security matters and that these low-rated vulnerabilities are impactful to them. Old, unsupported software is like Swiss cheese. It's full of holes. So don't think that you can avoid large upgrades by demanding smaller incremental patches. Generally speaking, keeping software up to date within vendor-supported life cycles will dramatically reduce your risk. So that means that when you're planning your IT lifecycle, you have to consider when what you're using goes end of life and have plans to upgrade, not just patch. This is particularly true when it comes to software exploitation, but it isn't just software by any means. Does anyone remember Spectre Meltdown? I know Crow does. It was a novel, never-seen-before type of vulnerability made public early 2018. Red Hat had 2 months to prepare, much longer than our standard 2-week embargo, and we needed that time. The cost to deliver 20 kernels to fix the issues was well over 8,000 people hours, weekly calls with Intel, daily internal calls across the organization, including support and legal. Performance engineering was involved to ensure we didn't impact performance too much. And obviously not every vulnerability is this dramatic or expensive, but all of this time focused on remediating Spectre Meltdown was time that wasn't spent on other potentially more impactful things. And as an aside, while they found weaponized exploit code to take advantage of this attack, I have personally not seen or heard of any evidence that anyone was ever actually exploited by it. And it took 3 years for that first fully weaponized Spectre exploit to be discovered. Now, that article was published in March of 2021 by Recorded Future. And this security researcher tweeted shortly after it was first made public in 2018 that the fix was worse than the problem. In fact, while we worked really hard to neutralize the exploitable code, the only real fix was to disable simultaneous multi-threading, or SMT. And if you're familiar with modern CPUs and how they work, they're made up of multiple cores and threads that allow you to enable tasks that can be run in parallel, leading to faster execution. So in layman's terms, more threads, better performance. Turning off SMT negates that benefit, and with cloud computing, makes those tasks slower and more expensive. So the cure is worse than the disease. Right? Sometimes fixing a vulnerability will introduce a new vulnerability that is now unknown, or creates another problem that has a more severe impact on your business. This is no different than any other software update, including the notable issue that struck some Windows systems not that long ago. And a more recent example, iPad OS 18. It fixed 33 CVEs. It also bricked some very shiny new M4 iPad Pros. Now, I'm not saying that that happened because of the security fixes, but it does demonstrate and highlight the risk of any change in software. And this is where we have to have that honest conversation about risk. Some people go so far as to say that fully disabling SMT is the only real fix for most of these speculative execution attacks. Now, to do so, you have to accept a potentially enormous reduction in efficiency and an increase in compute cost. So if we really wanted to fix all the things, then why did no one disable SMT? One last example that kind of highlights what I mean about transparency as a strength of open source. Back in 2001, it was found that Borland's Interbase had a hard-coded user and password in the source code for 7 years. It was only discovered after Interbase was released as the open source Firebird project, and that vulnerability existed for 7 years, and yet no one complained that it wasn't fixed because no one knew about it. Now, as soon as it was discovered, it was fixed. Now, on one hand, it was fixed because this is a pretty terrible vulnerability to have. On the other, it might have existed for many more years if it wasn't for open source's advantage of transparency. So after all of this, what do I want you to walk away with? Well, primarily that it's complicated. Right? Balancing risk acceptance and mitigation will always be a challenge. Open source has defined accelerated development and speed to market. Open source is broadly accepted across all industries. Yet we apply the same standards to open source as we do to proprietary. Even though the two are very different and in some very fundamental ways, we need to treat them differently, especially when it comes to risk awareness and tolerance. Maybe a very simple analogy will work here. You're sick and you get a prescription. The doctor weighs the risk of any side effects against the benefit that that prescription will bring. Most people don't pay attention to those side effects and just take the medicine as per the doctor's recommendation. Some will look at the side effects on their own, do their own research, and usually take it anyways. Now, the difference is that maybe now they know about it, and if you're like me, I tend to be a bit hypervigilant to see how I'm feeling after taking that medicine. But more often than not, we're not affected by a side effect. Sometimes we are, and we have to take some other medicine or take a trip back to the doctor. But what we don't do is, before taking that medicine, go back to the doctor and ask them to get rid of the side effects or provide a guarantee that there is a 0% chance the side effect will materialize, even the most minor ones. We don't ask for side effects to be removed when we don't know that they're there. We also don't ask for side effects to be removed when we do know that they are there. We do a risk calculation. The likely side effects are minor, we take our medicine, and usually we feel better as a result. And at the end of the day, we have to recognize that when we use proprietary software, we have always accepted unknown risk and have been okay with it. And when open source software became dominant and in many cases preferred, we misunderstood what we had implicitly accepted before and decided that because now we knew about it, we had to fix it. And I guarantee that the distribution of vulnerabilities in open and proprietary software is closer than what is being publicly disclosed, which means there are thousands of internally known and unreported moderate and low vulnerabilities in proprietary software that we accept because we are blissfully ignorant. Now, I don't think that governments should mandate all proprietary software become open or that proprietary vendors must disclose every single bug, yet that would, on the surface, be the only way to achieve a certain amount of equality between the two types of software. Now, that said, I do believe that there is something here about equity. Proprietary and open both have certain advantages that they leverage, yet open source's advantages are being leveraged to disadvantage it. Transparency is a major advantage, and yet that same advantage is used to penalize open source communities, vendors, and users. Now, open source has always been about empowering users, and that is no different when it comes to security. Transparency is power. And yet, as they say, with great power comes great responsibility. Yet that responsibility is on us, the end user, to accept that open source is different and its risks need to be assessed differently. The software procurement rules changed quite a while ago. The software security assessment rules still have to catch up. Thank you very much. So actually, unlike other people, we just have lunch, so I have 2 hours for Q&A. I'm kidding, no. But if anyone has any questions, you can ask me now, here, out there, wherever I'm around. But thanks very much for the time. Yes, sir.
How is it that vulnerability can be reported or realized, I guess, but not reported, not classified as a
A lot of, well, there's open source, well, I'll pick on open source as an example, right? I was actually looking at OSV, I'm writing a blog post right now, so I was looking at OSV, 4 vulnerabilities without CVs, and I found a couple this morning. So I mean, like, they could be, RubyGem modules, PyPI modules, I think this one was in PHP, and the authors just never asked for a CV. So they have like their GitHub security advisory. I think there was a GHSA associated with it, but they didn't ask for a CV, so none was assigned. The CV board doesn't actually push down, look for every single vulnerability and push down a CV. Usually you have to request them of a CNA or of the CV program directly. Now, if you're looking at something like, I'm going to pick on the mobile application space because I noted it before. I bother to read what the updates are for when you're updating your software. And I'll see some, maybe security fix or bug fixes or whatever, and so you download them. But when I see security fix, I never see a CV mentioned. And I'm pretty sure that if I went to like the CV database or to OSV and I was like looking for Candy Crush for vulnerability there, I'd probably find 0. Or any other iOS app that's out there, right? Similar for Android as well. Android might be a little bit different because there are some open source components that are used in some of those things that are known. So there might be some CVs associated with a few of those. But I would say by and large, if that part of the industry ever catches up to like actual assigning of CVs to security issues, those numbers before are going to seem paltry compared to what it looks like. So, yeah, you're welcome. Yes.
When you found the vulnerability, what do you do with that?
So if Red Hat finds a vulnerability, we assess the vulnerability based on its merits. So I have my own PCERT, and they are incident response team, and they'll evaluate that vulnerability in its use in our products. And so we'll take a look at a few things, and this is where NVD, not that I want to rag on them too much, kind of get this stuff wrong, right? They're trying to assign a single score to a vulnerability in a piece of source code without any consideration for how that source code is compiled or used. So you could choose to compile software without things like stack smashing protection or fortify source or some of the other wonderful technologies that are available for everybody to use in GCC as a compiler. And then maybe that vulnerability would be arbitrary code execution. But if you're compiling with SSP and it's a buffer overwrite and that renders it down to a crash, well, it's no longer arbitrary code execution, now it's denial of service, right? So your CVSS base score is going to drop because it's not doing the truly nefarious thing, now it's just a nuisance, right? So we actually look at the way that software is compiled, how it's used, which products it's being used in. So if you look at our CV pages, for example, you might see one global CVSS score that's kind of the default for all, and you might see a few others where it's different, and the impact rating is different. If we look at other vendors as well, so if I go out to look at what SUSE and Canonical and these others are doing, sometimes they have different ratings for these things as well based on the way that they compile or build these products themselves. And then you have to consider open source being ubiquitous. It runs on Windows, it runs on Mac OS, right? How does Apple rate these things? Well, I mean, Apple doesn't rate these things. They give you no information other than a CV name and a reporter. I was looking for, actually it's funny, I was looking for a vulnerability in libxSLT that Apple had reported and reported fixed, and I couldn't even find an upstream patch for it. So I mean, they use open source, but they're still really opaque about how they're using it.
But do you categorize them and then assign somebody to fix them?
Yeah, as per our life cycle policies, we fix all criticals and importance and known exploited. So we will work with the engineering teams, get a fix out as quickly as we can. For moderates and lows, these are typically, lows, I personally just consider these bugs. They're not even security issues, or shouldn't even be considered security issues. We don't bother to fix them. And many of the moderates we only fix opportunistically, usually when we're doing some other fix to that software or we're upgrading it to a later version, and the later version has that fix in it. The reason we don't want to fix all of them is because every time we do, we backport those upstream fixes to the version that we ship. So we're introducing code changes to something that our customers come to us and say, we want stable software. Every time you introduce a code change, you actually introduce a probability or the possibility of a new unknown vulnerability being introduced or some other negative impact in some other way.
You don't mind if I have a follow-up? Should you VP, how do you estimate fix the time to fix it? How do you estimate how to
Well, that's an impossible question because if you look at like Spectre and Meltdown, that was 2 months of engineering work to kind of put it together, right? And then still time after that, once the initial fixes went out, because there are other fixes to be found. Some are really simple, right? Some are probably like 5 minutes of a developer's time. It's a one-line patch, no big deal. Some of them are very complicated, and you can't say one size fits all. I could estimate it between 8 hours and 3 days, but what does that mean, right? It doesn't mean anything. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that, that we shouldn't be measuring security by proprietary and open source by the same standard. And you mentioned all these variables.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have an elevator speech about an alternative framework or a classification alternatives that, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, personally, I think, well, because it's been so abused and misunderstood, I think CVSS's time has come. It just needs to burn, right? It's just bad. NVD, by the same token, its time has come. It needs to burn. It is no longer helpful. In fact, it is anti-helpful, right? If I look at what like an industry standard way of rating vulnerabilities would be, it would be the way that Red Hat does it. Now, I'm biased, but it's also the way that Microsoft does it, right? We actually adopted ours based on theirs 20 years ago or whatever it was. That is a very objective view of what the impact of exploitation of that particular vulnerability is. So that's the critical through low. If you go to our security advisory page, it says very clearly what the criteria for each is. Microsoft's, they describe the same, they're not as in-depth as we are, but they describe the same scale system as well. And I think that's the right way to do it. Because I look at it as like those criticals and importance, those are the ones that are most likely to be exploited and that would be the most harmful impact. The moderates and lows are very rare to be exploited, and so it's just up to vendors to pay attention, right? So that's what we do. We try to pay attention to known exploitation. The other thing that I think is interesting and we probably need to look at a little bit more is the EPSS, right? I don't know if it's perfect yet. I was looking at some, I think it was like a bin utils CV from 6 years ago, and the EPS says there's an 85% chance it'll be exploited in the next 30 days. I'm like, maybe, but what are they gonna get out of it, right? So at the same time, that one we rated low, it's like, okay, if you do exploit it within the next 30 days, great. You're not gonna get anything out of it. You need to have, you have to basically be an administrator or have local access to exploit it anyway. So EPSS by itself, probably not so good. EPSS in conjunction with a severity rating that makes sense, probably really good. And I think doing something like that as industry standard would make a lot of sense. But the problem that I have right now, in fact, one customer that I'm having an escalation with is they will only look at CVSS scores provided by NIST, period. Any other attempt to, by logic and by proof, show them a better way, particularly the security team, is completely shut down. I was actually chatting with a fellow last night, and I thought he expressed this perfectly. He said, CVSS scores used by security teams are either uneducated or lazy. right? Because they're not doing any real risk assessment. If I'm looking at a base score from NVD that's telling me a local vulnerability in OBJ dump as part of bin utils is a 9.8, and a customer is jumping up and down saying, you need to fix this thing, I'm thinking, what planet are you on? Like, it is unserious. It is security theater, right? Yeah, Crump.
I'll slightly disagree with you about CVSS.
I'm okay with being disagreed with, yeah.
I completely agree about the score.
Yes.
But the string that defines how that vulnerability works.
The metrics are useful.
That is invaluable.
The-
That's invaluable information.
Agreed.
It's done by an expert that understands what's going on.
Agreed. So actually, maybe CVSS shouldn't burn. Maybe CVSS version 5 will get it right. I think base score metrics alone should result in a 0. It should always be 0. You have to add the temporal and the environmental metrics to it, and then you actually get a score. That, to me, would make sense. So maybe that's something I'll propose to the CVSS SIG. Yes? I don't think the CrowdStrike outage has changed people's minds towards open source. I think what it's done is, I think like in the earlier talk, Dan was talking about like interconnectedness and just like the scope of open source and just software in general, because CrowdStrike obviously isn't open source, right? But just when you're using a piece of open source that's spread out globally and used by so many, Log4j being an example as well, like it's really highlighted that we have to treat these things appropriately, right? And at the same time, I think it actually strengthens the argument for not willy-nilly fixing every random stupid thing, because what happened to CrowdStrike could literally happen if, say, for example, I decided I have to fix this low vulnerability in OpenShift, and we fix it, and we test it, but we don't test one particular use case, and it goes out there, and all of a sudden we're seeing all these OpenShift clusters falling over. I mean, that would be really bad, right? And it's like, is it worth the risk of that happening to fix this stupid little low vulnerability? Probably not. And I think that what happened with CrowdStrike is it demonstrated that code changes matter, and they can have those unknown consequences or unintended consequences if we're not careful. Yes, sir. Okay, I didn't hear all of what you were saying, but I think it was more around the lines of how we're assessing the vulnerability, like compared to NVD, or how it changes over time, or?
From a process standpoint, I guess cutting through the noise that is like behind new vulnerability emerge.
Yep.
The cups were that calculation a couple months ago.
Yep.
And it hit the news and everything gets 10. I blast all over my feed for the next like couple like a week. When y'all are evaluating that, we all evaluated it was much lower, which made more sense. It's more sane. An appropriate evaluation of what was going on.
Yep.
Like I got cut through the noise with like I guess I'm looking at those objectively. It's like hey, like actually we're going to evaluate this, we're evaluating objectively out of other customers.
Yeah, so my former boss, and incidentally Krob's boss as well, used to have this saying of, don't believe the hype, right? And so we actually established programs, I don't know, like 10 years ago, something like that, where if one of these things kind of popped up where we wanted to have better objective information for our customers, we actually we created our own hype around it, but usually it was like to constrain like people's panic. So back then we called them CSAWs, or Customer Security Awareness Advisories. Now we have Red Hat Security Bulletins that we put publicly available on our customer portal. And that's a way that our customers can know, like, hey, Red Hat's aware of this, and we usually go into a little bit more detail than we would say on a regular CV page or whatnot. Usually, and it's because those ones, like, we see it exploding on Twitter. And like the Cups one was interesting because the reporter had said that Red Hat had given it a 10. And I'm just like, geez Louise, like, well, we didn't. It was part of a private conversation within an industry group that some very wonderful person decided to leak, right? And it's like, yeah, we were discussing this vulnerability. At the outset, based on the information that we had at the time, it looked like it was pretty bad, like the knee-jerk reaction. But then we actually take that step back and we look at the vulnerability in its full context, and then we make actual judgment calls based on a technical evaluation and understand what the code does. And I mean, CUPS is not this root running, accessible to the internet according to best practices anyways. Shodan tells us that many people don't believe in best practices, right? Just because of that port being so exposed on the internet. But a best practice for a print server would be a local area network only, and it runs as an unprivileged user. So a 10 is like, even at the outset, just thinking about it, is like, well, it can't possibly be a 10 for these particular reasons. Right, and so we try to provide that explanation to our customers through these RHSBs. And if we have to, we'll take to Twitter, and we try not to feed the troll too often, but sometimes you have to, right? And we just try to make sure that that information's out there, because that's what our customers look to us for. Okay, well, I'm in between you guys and lunch, so thank you very much.